Martha's hands, gnarled and rough as oak bark, moved with a familiar grace through the tender ears of corn. The early morning sun cast long shadows across her small patch of land in Harlan County, the only world she'd known for 68 years. Each knuckle was cracked, a tiny map of droughts and hard winters, and a fresh line of crimson appeared where a sharp leaf grazed her skin, a minor pain she no longer registered. Her small clapboard house, weathered by decades of Kentucky storms, smelled of damp earth, black coffee simmering on the old wood stove, and a profound, settled solitude. On a rickety table, next to a faded photograph of her late husband, sat a rusted metal box. Inside, wrapped in what was once a baby blanket, lay the land deeds from 1947, her father's only inheritance. She thought of Richard, her boy in the city, and whispered a quiet prayer that he was eating well, never suspecting that the very soil clinging to her worn dress held a secret that would soon rewrite her entire existence. Before we continue Martha's story, we want to let you know that this narrative was brought to life with the help of artificial intelligence, but it has been carefully shaped and reviewed by our human team to ensure it carries a message that resonates with real human experiences and reflections. We believe stories are a powerful way to connect, and we are dedicated to bringing you tales that touch the heart and stir the soul. If you find value in these stories, please consider subscribing to our channel to not miss a single chapter. We would also love to hear from you, so please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your support helps us continue to create this content, and a simple like on the video makes a huge difference. Now let's return to the quiet strength of a mother whose sacrifice was about to be weighed on the scales of fate. Her life was a rhythm of survival, dictated by the sun and the seasons. She would rise before the birds, her stooped back aching as she pulled on her mended dress and worn-out boots. The face that looked back at her from the cracked piece of mirror on the wall was a testament to a life lived outdoors, her skin a canvas of deep lines etched by worry and weather. Loneliness was a constant companion, a quiet presence that sat with her as she ate her meager meals of beans and cornbread. She would wash her hands at the outdoor pump, scrubbing with a harsh bar of soap, but the Kentucky soil was a permanent stain under her nails and deep within the creases of her palms. They were the hands of a provider, the hands that had picked cotton, tilled soil, and sewn patches onto tiny trousers so her son could go to school looking respectable, a history of sacrifice that Richard had long since chosen to forget. The rusted metal box was not just a container, it was a shrine. Several times a year, Martha would sit at her small table, carefully lift the lid and unwrap the folded papers. The land deeds were brittle, the ink of her father's name, Aurelius, faded to a ghostly brown. To her they weren't a legal document of ownership, but a tangible piece of the man she barely remembered, a sacred promise to never leave the land that had sustained their family. She'd run her calloused fingers over the surveyor's lines, seeing only the rocky, stubborn plot that yielded just enough to get by, never imagining it held any real monetary worth. She saw it as a burden her son had wisely escaped. Closing the box, she would sigh, her thoughts drifting back to Richard in his gleaming city of Atlanta, a world so far removed from this dirt and dust that he might as well be on the moon. She hoped he was happy, completely unaware that he had discarded the very key to a fortune beyond his wildest dreams. The memories were etched into her bones, deeper than the lines on her face. Richard's father had been a kind man, with a laugh that could fill their small house, but his lungs were filled with the coal dust of the Harlan mines. He faded slowly, a candle flame dwindling in a draught, until one autumn morning he was gone. Martha was left with a 5-year-old boy, a barren patch of land, and a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. She remembered holding Richard's small hand at the gravesite, looking down at her own hands, still young but already tough from farm work. She had made a promise to her dying husband, a whispered vow over his labored breaths, that their son would never see the inside of a mine, that he would have a life built on books, not on breaking his back. That promise became her religion, the singular, driving force that got her out of bed each morning, before the sun had even thought about rising over the mountains. Her days became a grueling rhythm of relentless labor. It wasn't just her own small plot of corn and beans, that was never enough. She hired herself out to the larger farms in the valley, her body becoming a machine fueled by sheer will. She spent summers under the blistering Kentucky sun, her back bent for hours picking tobacco, the sticky tar coating her fingers and the sweat stinging her eyes. In the fall, she'd haul heavy sacks of grain and feed, the rough burlap chafing her skin raw, her muscles screaming in protest each night as she collapsed onto her cot. Winters were spent mending fences in the freezing rain, her fingers growing numb and stiff around the cold wire. The smell of damp earth, animal sweat, and her own exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. Her hands transformed from those of a young wife into hardened tools, the palms thick with calluses, and the knuckles permanently swollen, each crack and scar a testament to a payment made in flesh for her son's future. There were sacrifices that cut deeper than physical pain, moments that carved hollow spaces in her soul. When Richard was 14, he needed a set of encyclopedias for a school project, a luxury as unattainable as the moon. Martha's only assets, besides the land, were 2 milk goats her father had given her, her last living connection to him. For 2 days she agonized, but Richard's future always won. She walked the goats to the market herself, avoiding their trusting eyes, her throat tight as she handed the ropes to a stranger in exchange for a handful of crumpled bills. That night, as Richard excitedly flipped through the pages of his new books under the lamplight, Martha drank a cup of hot water for her dinner, telling him her stomach was upset. The lie was bitter on her tongue, but the sight of his studious face was all the nourishment she needed. She never told him about the goats. Some burdens were a mother's alone to carry. Every spare coin was a sacred object, a seed for a future she was planting. She kept an old rusted coffee can hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. Into this secret vault went every penny saved from mending a neighbor's shirt, every dime earned from selling a few extra eggs at the market. It was a slow accumulation, a testament to years of self-denial. When Richard announced he had been accepted into a state college program, the can was finally brought out from its hiding place. The metallic clink of the coins as she poured them onto the table was the sound of a decade of skipped meals and worn-out shoes. She counted the money with hands that trembled, not with weakness, but with the sheer emotional weight of the moment. It was enough for his tuition and the bus ticket to the city. She pressed the worn bills into his hand, a transfer of her life's work into his hopeful future, her own world shrinking as his began to expand. His letters from the city were like dispatches from another planet. He wrote of tall buildings that scraped the sky, of libraries with more books than she could ever imagine, and of a world that moved at a dizzying pace. Martha would sit by her kerosene lamp, her finger tracing his words, her heart a tangled mix of pride and a quiet, creeping sorrow. The boy who once ran barefoot through her cornfields was becoming a man who wore polished shoes and spoke of corporate ladders and investment portfolios. With each letter, the distance between Harlan County and Atlanta grew, a chasm not just of miles but of experience. He was everything she had ever dreamed he would be, a success built on the foundation of her sacrifice. But he was also becoming a stranger, a polished reflection of a man she no longer fully recognized as the small boy whose scraped knees she had so often cleaned and kissed. The day he left for good, to take the job at Wellington Estates, the air was still and heavy. He stood in the doorway of the clapboard house, his new suit looking alien against the weathered wood. He gave her a quick, awkward hug, the fabric of his jacket smooth and foreign against her rough, mended dress. He promised he would call every week, that he would send for her once he was settled. Martha just nodded, the words caught in her throat like stones. She watched from the porch as his bus pulled away, a cloud of dust obscuring it from view, long after the sound of its engine had faded. The silence that rushed back in to fill the space was absolute. The house, which had once echoed with a child's laughter and a husband's cough, was now just an empty shell. Her life's great project was complete, her purpose fulfilled. She had given him the world, and in doing so, she had been left utterly and completely alone. Richard adjusts his silk tie, the knot perfect and tight like the control he maintains over his life. From his office on the 15th floor of the Wellington Estates Tower, Atlanta sprawls below, a glittering tapestry of concrete and ambition. The world of Harlan County, with its scent of wet earth and wood smoke, is a distant, suppressed memory. His suit is Italian, his shoes gleam with a fresh polish, and his hands are smooth, unblemished by manual labor. They are the hands of a man who signs documents, not one who shucks corn. He is a project manager, a title that sounds solid and respectable, a world away from the dirt floors and patched-up clothes of his youth. The air in his office is sterile, filtered, smelling only of leather and success, a deliberate and carefully constructed fortress against the past he has worked so diligently to bury. His phone buzzes on the glass desk, a message from Catherine Wellington, his fiancée. It's a photo of a floral arrangement for their upcoming wedding, a cascade of white orchids and lilies that costs more than his mother makes in a year. Her text reads, "Perfection, darling, no compromises." Catherine is the architect of this new life, the daughter of the man who owns it all. Her hands, which he often holds, are soft, her nails perfectly manicured, adorned with a diamond that could buy his mother's entire plot of land 10 times over. She is beautiful, sophisticated, and utterly intolerant of anything she deems common or unrefined. She is his greatest prize and his most vigilant gatekeeper, ensuring that no trace of the boy from the mountains ever slips through the cracks of the man he pretends to be. He met her at a company gala 2 years ago. He was just a junior associate at Wellington Estates, but his hunger was palpable. Mr. Wellington saw a sharp, ambitious young man with no family ties to distract him, a blank slate he could mold. Richard saw his chance. Catherine was the key, the entry point into a dynasty. On their third date, over wine so expensive it felt like a sin to drink, he began to weave the tale. He spoke of a quiet, intellectual upbringing, of 2 loving schoolteacher parents who tragically died in a car crash just as he was graduating college. The lie came out smoothly, practiced in front of his bathroom mirror. It was a clean amputation, a severing of the roots that he believed would only hold him down in the mud of his origins. The story became his gospel, repeated with somber reverence at every family dinner in the Wellington mansion. "I have no one left," he would say, looking down at his plate, a performance of dignified sorrow that always earned him a sympathetic nod from Mr. Wellington. The lie was a shield. It explained why no relatives ever called, why he had no childhood photos to share, why his past was a sealed and silent vault. He learned to live inside this fiction, to believe it almost as much as they did. Each time he told it, the real memories of his mother's cracked hands and the smell of her wood stove faded a little more, replaced by the ghost of a life he had invented. He was an orphan of his own making, a self-created man standing on a foundation of pure deceit. One afternoon, a potential investor, a man who prided himself on his man-of-the-people persona, brought a bag of roasted corn to their meeting, bought from a street vendor. "Best in Atlanta," the man boomed, offering an ear to Richard. The smell hit him first, sweet, smoky, earthy. It was the smell of his childhood, the smell of poverty, the smell of his mother's kitchen. A wave of nausea and panic washed over him. He forced a tight smile, accepted the corn, and waited until the man left the conference room. Then, with a grimace of pure revulsion, he dropped the ear of corn into the wastebasket as if it were contaminated. He walked briskly to the executive washroom and scrubbed his hands with hot water and expensive soap, trying to wash away not just the scent, but the shame it unearthed. That evening, as Martha sat in the growing dark of her clapboard house, chewing on a piece of dry cornbread, Richard stood beside Catherine at a charity auction. He swirled a deep red Cabernet in a crystal glass, the murmur of polite society a comforting hum around him. He caught his reflection in the polished surface of a marble column, a man in a tailored tuxedo, a confident smile fixed on his face. But for a fleeting moment the reflection wavered, and he saw the hollow eyes of a terrified boy running from a past that clung to him like his own shadow. The world he had built was magnificent, a gleaming fortress of lies, but he was its sole prisoner, and he knew in a cold, deep part of his soul that one day the walls would inevitably come crashing down. The dust cloud appeared first, a brown plume rising against the blue Kentucky sky, announcing an arrival long before the vehicle itself was visible. Martha stood on her porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. A sleek, black car, so out of place it looked like a spaceship, landed in her yard, crunched to a halt on the gravel. Richard emerged. Not the boy she remembered, but a man encased in an expensive suit that seemed to repel the very air of the countryside. He did not move toward her for an hug, instead leaning against the polished door of his car, as if afraid to get too close. He looked at her small weathered house with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of impatience and something that looked painfully like shame. His gaze swept over her patched dress and worn boots, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face, a silent judgment that made the space between them feel like a canyon. "Mom," he began, his voice lacking its usual warmth, carrying the clipped, efficient tone he used for business. "I'm getting married in 3 days." The words should have been a cause for celebration, a moment of shared joy, but they hung in the heavy air like a sentence. He looked at his polished shoes, unable to meet her eyes. "Catherine's family. They're important people. Mr. Wellington's family. They have certain expectations." Martha waited, her hands now clasped tightly in front of her, the knuckles white. He finally looked up, his eyes cold and distant. "I needed a clean slate, a simple backstory. I told them you passed away, that you died in an accident right after Dad." He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as if discussing a line item on a budget. He had not just erased her from his future, he had buried her in his past, a convenient ghost to pave his way to fortune. The world did not shatter. The sun did not fall from the sky. For Martha, the world simply went silent. The chirping of the crickets, the rustle of the wind in the corn, all of it faded into a dull, hollow hum inside her head. There was no surge of anger, no welling of tears. There was only a vast, cavernous emptiness opening up inside her chest, a void where a sun used to be. She looked at him, truly looked at the man standing by the expensive car, and saw a complete stranger. The features were familiar, but the soul behind the eyes was gone. Her hands, those hands that had worked themselves to the bone for him, hung limp at her sides. They felt heavy, useless. She gave a single slow nod, an acknowledgement not of his request, but of a death. The death of the boy she had raised. The death of the love she had believed was unconditional. He took her silence as agreement, gave a curt nod back, and got into his car, leaving her alone with the ghost he had just created. On the day of the wedding, Martha rose before dawn. She put on her best dress, the one with the fewest patches, and began to walk. It was not an act of defiance, nor was it a plea for recognition. It was a pilgrimage, a final, necessary journey to witness the life her own had been sacrificed to build. The 3-hour walk to the Wellington estate was a meditation through familiar landscapes. She passed fields she had worked in, fences she had mended, her feet in their worn boots knowing every stone and root in the path. As she drew closer, the dirt roads gave way to paved lanes, and the humble farmhouses were replaced by sprawling mansions hidden behind iron gates. The air itself seemed to change, losing the scent of earth and gaining the manicured fragrance of cut grass and privilege. She felt like a traveler crossing into a foreign country, a land where she had no passport and spoke a language no one understood. She found a place among a copse of old oak trees on a hill overlooking the pristine white chapel. From her vantage point, she was just a shadow, a part of the landscape. She watched as guests arrived in their gleaming cars, women in bright dresses and men in dark suits, their laughter carrying on the breeze like distant music. The world below was a spectacle of white flowers, white ribbons, and shimmering crystal. Then the chapel doors opened and she saw him. Richard stood there, beaming, his arm linked with Catherine's, who looked like a princess from a storybook. They posed for photographs, their smiles perfect, their happiness a radiant, impenetrable fortress. In that moment, watching the sun she had bathed, fed, and clothed in a world of impossible luxury, Martha felt the full, crushing weight of her own invisibility. She was a ghost at the feast, the silent, unseen foundation upon which this entire glittering charade had been built. A waiter, carrying a tray of champagne flutes, noticed her standing there, a stark, solitary figure against the trees. He leaned over and whispered something to Richard. Martha saw her son's gaze lift, sweeping the grounds until it locked with hers. For a single breathless moment, the universe held still. She saw a flicker of panic in his eyes, the terror of a man whose two worlds were about to collide. Then She watched as a mask of cold indifference descended over his face. He turned slightly toward the waiter, his voice carrying clearly across the manicured lawn, each word a perfectly aimed stone. "I don't know who she is," he said, his tone casual, dismissive. "Probably just some beggar. Have security get her out of here." The words were not shouted, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last fragile thread of connection that had somehow survived all the years and all the lies. She did not flinch. She did not cry out. As two uniformed security guards began to walk in her direction, Martha simply turned away. There was no shame in her retreat, only a profound and desolate finality. She did not wait for them to reach her, to put their hands on her, to escort her from the property like a common trespasser. With a quiet dignity that came from a place deeper than pride, she began her long walk home. Her back, already stooped by a lifetime of labor, felt impossibly heavy, yet she did not stumble. She walked away from the music, from the laughter, from the son who had just publicly executed her memory. She was walking away from the Wellington estate, but more than that, she was walking away from the land that had belonged to her father, a land where she was now officially and irrevocably a stranger. The path ahead was lonely, but for the first time it was entirely her own. The walk back was a blur of dust and fading light. When Martha finally reached her small clapboard house, night had completely fallen. She pushed open the creaking door and stepped into a darkness that was as absolute inside as it was out. She didn't bother to light the kerosene lamp. Her body, fueled by a grief so profound it felt like a physical illness, moved on pure instinct, carrying her to the simple cot in the corner. She sat down, her back ramrod straight, and stared into the blackness. The silence of the house was no longer a familiar comfort. It was a crushing weight, an active presence that amplified the echo of Richard's words. Just some beggar. The phrase played over and over in her mind, a cold, sharp blade twisting in the wound of her heart. She didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears, a desolate emptiness that had hollowed her out completely, leaving only a fragile shell sitting motionless in the cold, silent dark. 2 days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting patterns of light and shadow that crept across the dusty floorboards. Martha did not eat. She did not sleep. She barely moved from the cot, a living statue carved from sorrow. The familiar pangs of hunger were a distant, unimportant sensation compared to the gnawing ache in her soul. The water bucket was empty, but the thought of walking to the well, of the sheer physical effort of working the pump handle, was insurmountable. The house grew colder, the scent of damp earth and disuse beginning to permeate the air. The world outside continued on. Birds sang at dawn, the wind rustled the cornstalks. But inside her small weathered home, time had stopped. She was adrift in a silent grey ocean of despair, completely erased from the world of the living by the one person she had lived for. On the third morning, a primal instinct for survival, faint as a dying ember, stirred within her. She forced her stiff limbs to move, pulling on her worn boots with hands that trembled from weakness and cold. Her destination was the small general store a mile down the road, the only place with a public telephone. Each step was an act of will, her feet feeling as heavy as lead. Inside the dusty store, the smell of sawdust and cured meats did little to stir her appetite. She fumbled with the coins she had, her fingers clumsy as she dropped them into the slot and dialed the number she knew by heart. She listened to the clicks and whirs, a fragile thread of hope connecting her to the city. But instead of Richard's voice, a cool, impersonal operator spoke. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." The connection was severed. The last faint hope was extinguished, leaving only the dial tone's monotonous hum. Her shoulders slumped. The walk back to her empty house felt impossible. She turned to Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, a man who had known her since she was a girl. "Henry," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse, "could I get a small bag of beans on credit, just until I can find some work?" It was the ultimate humiliation, a confession of her complete and utter failure. Mr. Henderson shuffled his feet, his gaze dropping to the worn floorboards. He couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Martha," he mumbled, his voice thick with discomfort. "You already owe me too much. Business is slow." The refusal was quiet, almost gentle, But it landed like a slap. It wasn't just about the beans. It was a community turning its back, a final confirmation that she was truly, utterly alone, a ghost in her own life with no one left to call and nowhere left to turn. That night was the longest of her life. The cold was a physical entity, seeping through the cracks in the walls and up through the floorboards, sinking its teeth into her bones. Hunger was no longer a dull ache, but a sharp, twisting pain in her stomach. She lay on her cot, pulling the thin, threadbare blanket up to her chin, but it offered no warmth. She shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering in the profound silence. This, she thought, was the bottom. This was the valley of the shadow. She looked at her hands in the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy window. They were gnarled, the knuckles swollen, the skin cracked like a dry riverbed. These hands had built a life for her son, and now they were empty. For the first time she wondered if it was worth seeing the sunrise. The thought of simply closing her eyes and letting the cold take her was not frightening. It felt like a quiet, merciful release. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to break the horizon, a firm, steady knock echoed through the silent house. The sound was so unexpected it felt like a hallucination. Martha didn't move. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a familiar voice calling her name. "Martha, it's Sarah Davis. Are you in there?" Slowly, painfully, Martha pushed herself up and shuffled to the door. Standing on her porch was her neighbor, Mrs. Davis, a widow whose face was as lined with hardship as her own. "Mrs." Davis took one look at Martha's hollow eyes and gaunt frame and pushed past her into the house without a word of greeting. Her gaze swept over the cold stove, the empty water bucket, the untouched cot. She didn't ask questions or offer pity. She simply began to act, a whirlwind of quiet, determined purpose in the stagnant air of the house. Mrs. Davis went straight to the wood stove, her movements efficient and practiced. She used the last of Martha's kindling and a few pieces of wood she'd brought from her own pile to coax a small flame to life. The crackle and pop of the fire was the first warm, living sound the house had heard in days. As the small room began to shed its bone-deep chill, Mrs. Davis returned from her own home with a covered pot. The rich, savory scent of chicken broth filled the air, a fragrance of life and nourishment that cut through the stale smell of despair. She ladled the steaming broth into a chipped mug and sat on the edge of Martha's cot. "Here now," she said softly but firmly. "You need to eat." She held the mug to Martha's lips and tilted it gently, forcing her to take a sip, then another. It was more than food. It was an act of profound kindness, a lifeline thrown into the abyss. "You're not alone, Martha," Mrs. Davis whispered, her voice steady. "As long as I'm here, you're not alone." And in that simple promise, a tiny, resilient seed of hope began to take root in the barren soil of Martha's heart. 6 months had passed, 6 months in which a quiet, fragile routine had taken root in the small clapboard house. Mrs. Davis's presence had been a constant, a steadying hand that helped Martha rebuild the simple scaffolding of her life, one shared meal and one tended cornstalk at a time. Then, one Tuesday morning, a new and unfamiliar sound disturbed the peace of the valley. It was the low rumble of an engine, followed by the crunch of tires on the gravel path. A pristine white government pickup truck, emblazoned with an official seal on its door, parked where Richard's luxury car had once stood. 3 men emerged, their crisp shirts and polished shoes looking utterly alien against the backdrop of weathered wood and wild grass. 2 were young, with the serious, focused expressions of engineers, while the third was an older man in a formal suit, carrying a leather briefcase. They approached the porch slowly, their city-bred caution evident as they navigated the uneven ground, their gazes taking in the profound poverty of the place with a mixture of professional detachment and quiet surprise. They introduced themselves with formal handshakes, their hands soft and smooth against Martha's calloused palm. They were from the U.S. Geological Survey, they explained, and the man in the suit, Attorney Miller, represented the state. They asked if they could use her small wooden table. With a nod from Martha, they unrolled a series of large, complex maps covering the scarred surface of the table with grids, contour lines, and colored zones. The attorney spoke in calm, measured tones, using words like extensive subterranean surveys, seismic resonance testing, and unprecedented aquifer discovery. He pointed to a deep blue section on the map, a vast, sprawling shape that dwarfed all other features. "This," he said, tapping a precise point with his pen, "is the epicenter, and it is directly beneath your feet, Mrs. Aurelius." He then asked respectfully if she was in possession of the original property deeds from 1947. With a slow, deliberate movement, Martha went inside and returned with the rusted metal box, its contents the only proof of a life she was beginning to believe had been worthless. Attorney Miller handled the brittle, yellow documents with the reverence of a historian. He examined the faded ink, the surveyor's marks, and the signature of her father, Aurelius. After a moment of silent study, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "These are legitimate and incontestable," he confirmed. "According to the state of Kentucky and the federal government, you are the sole rightful owner of this parcel." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the still morning air. "The government requires access to this aquifer for regional water supply. It is a matter of critical public infrastructure. Therefore, we are authorized to make you a formal offer for a permanent concession." He opened his briefcase and removed a thick, official-looking document. He cleared his throat and read the defining sentence aloud. "In exchange for access and extraction rights, the government offers you a one-time payment of $47 million, supplemented by annual royalties, a lifetime pension, and the immediate construction of a new modern home on a site of your choosing on this property." Martha listened, her face a stoic mask. The number, 47 million, was so abstract, so impossibly large, that it held no meaning. It was a sound, not a concept. Mrs. Davis, standing beside her, let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth, but Martha remained perfectly still. Her gaze drifted from the lawyer's face to her own hands, resting on the table beside the maps. These hands, stained with the very dirt that was now somehow worth a fortune, did not even tremble. Attorney Miller slid the contract and a pen across the table. The pen felt strange in her grip, a smooth, cold, weightless object compared to the familiar heft of a hoe or a shovel. Her signature, practiced only on the occasional form at the general store, was slow and labored, the letters shaky but clear. As soon as the men had packed their maps and driven away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake, Martha sat down on her porch step. She did not feel joy or relief. She felt a profound and unsettling sense of irony, as if the land itself, after a lifetime of silent witness to her suffering, had finally risen up to pass its own righteous judgment. The government's efficiency was a force of nature. Within a week, surveyors were walking the property, their bright vests like strange flowers blooming in the tall grass. A week after that, a construction crew arrived. They approached the old clapboard house with a gentle respect, carefully dismantling the structure that had held 68 years of hardship within its weathered walls. Martha watched from a distance as the place of her birth, her marriage, and her deepest sorrow was taken down piece by piece. A new foundation was poured on higher ground, a solid, concrete promise of a different future. The first installment of the money appeared in a newly opened bank account, a string of numbers that her mind struggled to comprehend. Her first act was not to buy a new dress or a piece of furniture. She drove with Mrs. Davis to the general store and with a quiet and unwavering voice paid off her small debt. Then she bought every single canned good, bag of flour and sack of beans in the store, instructing a stunned Mr. Henderson to have it all delivered to the local church, no questions asked. News in a small, tight-knit community like Harlan County travels not on wires but on the wind, passed from porch to porch over fence posts and church pews. The story of Martha, the quiet widow who had been brought to her knees, was suddenly transformed into a local legend. It was a tale of impossible fortune, a biblical-style miracle that affirmed the community's deepest beliefs in justice and fate. The local paper ran a front-page story with a grainy photo of her old house headlined, "Harlan County Dirt Turns to Diamonds." From there it was picked up by a regional news syndicate. The human interest angle too compelling to ignore. The story of the reclusive farmer, the forgotten land deeds, and the $47 million aquifer began its inexorable spread. It traveled south, carried on waves of ink and pixels, making its way toward the gleaming glass towers of Atlanta, destined to land on the polished mahogany desk of a man who had built his entire world on the lie that his mother and the ground she came from were worth nothing. The article from the Harlan County Chronicle, syndicated and reprinted in an Atlanta business journal, landed on Mr. Wellington's mahogany desk with a soft thud. He read it once, then a second time, his apathetic curiosity quickly hardening into a cold, calculating fury. The name Aurelius, the mention of 1947 land deeds, the impossible sum of $47 million, it all clicked into place with the sickening finality of a vault door locking. This was not just some quaint human interest story. It was a chronicle of the biggest financial blunder of his career. He had spent decades consolidating land in that region, and the key to its true wealth had been dangled right in front of him, concealed by the pathetic, transparent lie of a social climbing son-in-law. The land Richard had dismissed as worthless, the family he had buried with a convenient story, was now a fountain of unimaginable wealth. And he had been played for a fool by a boy who wasn't even smart enough to recognize the value of his own inheritance. He summoned Richard to his office, the newspaper spread open on the desk like an indictment. Mr. Wellington didn't raise his voice. His words were quiet, precise, and far more terrifying than any shout. "Your mother," he said, tapping a manicured finger on the photograph of Martha's old house. "I believe you told me she was a deceased schoolteacher." Richard's blood ran cold, the carefully constructed facade of his life shattering into a million pieces. "You are not just a liar, Richard. A liar can be useful. You are a fool. You stood on a gold mine and complained about the dirt on your shoes. You cost me a fortune. Not through malice, but through sheer pathetic ignorance. You are a bad investment." He leaned back in his leather chair, his face a mask of utter contempt. "Your employment at Wellington Estates is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Do not contact my daughter." When he arrived at the sprawling estate, his keycard already deactivated, Catherine was waiting for him on the grand marble staircase. Her expression was not one of betrayal or sadness, but of pure, unadulterated disgust. 2 expensive suitcases stood packed at her feet. She held a crisp legal document in her hand. "My father called me," she said, her voice like chipping ice. "He explained the situation. He gave me a choice, Richard, and I never, ever choose the losing side." She dropped the divorce papers onto the top of his suitcase. "The car is company property. It's already been collected. The accounts have been frozen. You have 30 minutes to gather any personal effects that are not in these bags before the new security codes are activated." She didn't wait for a response, simply turned and walked back up the stairs, her heels clicking a final merciless rhythm on the cold marble, leaving him standing alone in the cathedral-like foyer of a life that was no longer his. In less than 24 hours, his entire world was dismantled. He lost the job that defined him, the wife who was his ticket to society, and the house that was his fortress against the past. His designer suits felt like a costume on a man with nowhere to go. His gold watch a mockery on a wrist that could no longer afford to pay for lunch. He spent a few weeks in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Atlanta, the smell of stale smoke and desperation a stark contrast to the filtered air of his former life. He tried calling old contacts, but word of his disgrace, orchestrated by the powerful Mr. Wellington, had spread like a virus. No one would take his calls. The man who had once commanded boardrooms found himself on the street, his savings dwindling, his identity erased. The polished reflection in the shop windows was no longer a successful executive but a hollowed-out ghost, a man who had sold his soul for a kingdom and now had neither. With his last few dollars, he bought a bus ticket heading north, a journey back into the past he had so violently rejected. The smooth ride of a luxury sedan was replaced by the lurching groan of a Greyhound bus, the scent of expensive cologne replaced by the smell of exhaust fumes and tired bodies. He stared out the window as the gleaming skyscrapers of Atlanta gave way to endless stretches of highway, then to the rolling green hills of Kentucky. The final leg of the journey was on foot, a long, humiliating trek down the same dusty road his mother had walked away from his wedding. His expensive city shoes, now scuffed and broken, were ill-suited for the gravel and dirt. He was thinner, his face gaunt and covered with a patchy, untrimmed beard. He was no longer Richard, the project manager. He was just a man walking toward the ruins of his life, hoping to find a single stone left upon which he could beg for shelter. He crested the final hill and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The landscape of his memory was gone. Where the dilapidated clapboard house had once stood, a symbol of the poverty he so despised, there was now a new home. It was a modest but solid brick house with a clean shingled roof, a wide, welcoming porch, and a garden bursting with colorful flowers. Smoke curled gently from a stone chimney, a sign of warmth and life within. It was a picture of simple, unassailable dignity. And there, sitting on a rocking chair on the porch, was his mother. She was shucking corn, her movements as calm and rhythmic as they had always been. She looked up and saw him standing there, a broken silhouette against the afternoon sun. She did not rise. She did not beckon. She simply watched him approach, her expression unreadable, her stillness more intimidating than any wall he had ever faced. He stumbled the last few feet and fell to his knees in the dirt before her, the carefully constructed dam of his pride finally breaking. Sobs racked his body, raw and ugly. "Mom," he choked out, his face buried in his hands. "Forgive me. Please, forgive me. I was a fool, a monster. I threw everything away. I lost it all. I have nothing left. Nowhere to go." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "I was so wrong, so stupidly, horribly wrong." Martha slowly placed the ear of corn she was holding into the basket beside her. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked down at the weeping man at her feet. Her eyes held no hatred, no anger, and most painfully for him, no pity. They held only a deep, quiet, and unshakable calm, the peace of a woman who had already weathered the worst of the storm and had nothing left to fear. "I do forgive you, Richard," she said, her voice soft but firm, each word landing with the weight of truth. "I forgave you the day you called me a beggar. A mother's heart has to forgive or it turns to stone, but that forgiveness is for me, son. It's for my soul, so I can sleep at night. It is not a key for you to unlock my door." She looked out toward the fields, a distant look in her eyes. "When you had everything, you wanted me dead and buried. Now that you have nothing, you want me alive and welcoming. But I am the same woman, Richard. The same woman with dirt under her nails you were so ashamed of." She stood up slowly, her joints aching slightly. "The love of a mother is a deep well, but it is not bottomless. You have drunk it dry. I forgive you, but forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Go now, find your own way. Build something real this time, but build it far away from here." She turned without another word, opened the door to her new house and closed it gently behind her. The soft click of the latch, a sound more final than any slammed door could ever be. Martha's days now followed a rhythm of peace, not necessity. She still woke before the sun, but now it was a choice, a quiet greeting to the morning. Her new home, a sturdy brick house with a wide porch, was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and baking bread, a world away from the damp earth and solitude of her old clapboard shack. She spent her mornings in her garden, her hands, still calloused but no longer cracked and bleeding, moving through the rich soil. She tended to her corn patch, not for survival, but for the simple, grounding pleasure of it. The work was the same, but the weight was gone. The land that had once demanded her sweat and tears now simply offered its bounty in return. She had everything she needed and more, but her greatest wealth was the profound, unshakable silence in her soul, a quiet that was no longer empty, but full of contentment. She had not just been given a fortune, she had been given back the years the struggle had stolen from her. She was not alone in this newfound peace. Mrs. Davis had moved into one of the spare rooms, her presence a constant, comforting hum in the house. The two widows, forged by a shared history of hardship, now shared a future of ease. They spent afternoons on the porch, shucking corn or shelling peas, their conversation a gentle stream of local news and old memories. Together, they planted a vibrant flower garden that became a splash of defiant color against the green landscape, a testament to the beauty that could grow from scarred earth. Martha's generosity became a quiet, local legend. Every month, a truck from the general store would deliver a massive order of supplies to the Harlan County Church food pantry, always paid for in cash, always with the instruction that it was from an anonymous friend. She sought no recognition. Her reward was knowing that no one else in her valley would ever have to feel the sting of being denied a simple bag of beans. The old, rusted metal box no longer sat hidden under a bed. The 1947 land deeds, once brittle and forgotten, were now preserved behind glass, encased in a simple, elegant oak frame that hung above the fireplace in her new living room. They were the centerpiece of the home. When visitors would comment on the fortune they represented, Martha would gently correct them. She didn't see $47 million when she looked at the faded ink. She saw her father's hand. She saw a promise kept across generations. She saw the stubborn loyalty of her family to a piece of earth that the world had deemed worthless. The document was not a trophy of her wealth, but a monument to her roots. It was a daily reminder that the truest value is often invisible, buried deep beneath the surface, waiting not for a surveyor's equipment but for a lifetime of faith and quiet endurance. She rarely thought of Richard. His memory was not a source of pain or anger, but a faded photograph of a person she once knew. The act of closing her door to him had not been one of vengeance, but of self-preservation, a final, necessary boundary to protect the peace she had so dearly earned. She held no resentment because resentment was a heavy stone, and she had carried enough weight for one lifetime. But she also held no expectation. She did not watch the road for a returning car or listen for a voice on the phone. She had given him her forgiveness, and in doing so, had set herself free. His life, his choices, and his regrets were his own burdens to carry now. Her world was no longer defined by his absence or his potential return. It was defined by the rising sun, the smell of her garden, and the steady companionship of a true friend. From time to time, news would filter back to Harlan County, carried by truck drivers or distant relatives. They spoke of a man who fit Richard's description, seen working as a day laborer on construction sites in Tennessee, then later on a farm in Alabama. They described a gaunt, haunted figure with the hollow eyes of a man who had lost his way, his once soft hands now rough and calloused from manual labor. He was a ghost, drifting through the back roads of the country, forever chasing the life he had so carelessly discarded. He was living out the very existence he had once despised, a walking embodiment of his own punishment. Martha would listen to these stories with a quiet, detached sadness, a sorrow for the boy she had raised, not for the man he had become. His fate was a story that belonged to someone else now, a chapter in a book she had long since closed. In the evenings, Martha would sit on her porch, a simple shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and watch the sun dip below the Appalachian Ridge, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air would grow cool, carrying the scent of cut grass and blooming night flowers. She would look out over the land, her land, and a deep, peaceful smile would settle on her face. She had learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of all, that what is built on lies will inevitably crumble to dust, and what is rooted in truth, no matter how humble, will endure. She was a living testament to that truth, a woman who had been discarded like a stone, but had become the mountain. Because the land doesn't forget who works it with love, and life, sooner or later, always puts everyone back in their rightful place.